Explained by the Billy Meier contacts, mysteries, myths, legends, conspiracy theories, historical inaccuracies, and more. Compiled by David Chance, revised October 18, 2023.
Dalai Lama, Tenzin Gyatso, the Beastandizin MT Show, 14th Dalai Lama. Contact Report 261.
But now I have a question about the Dalai Lama. Yesterday evening we had a little discussion, which led to the question if he belonged to our group, which I answered with a no, because Quetzal once gave me an answer of this form. But we did not talk about whether he, the Dalai Lama, belonged to the outer circle of those who were involved as voluntary advisors and helpers at the decisive early time. Do you know anything about it?
His spiritual form and his total block of consciousness are indeed among those former personalities who were active as external, voluntary counselors and helpers. However, there is no relationship with today's core group, for in his form he works freely, although the circumstances do not correspond exactly to the provisions he was supposed to fulfill. In principle, he should have been a free teacher of the teaching of the Spirit, without being bound to any religion.
This raises a new question. Why did the Dalai Lama come to Buddhism when he should have been a free teacher? I was asked this question, which I then answered as follows, and I hope that I was right. The Buddhist monks, as is generally known, seek their head with the help of meditation and with visions, etc., when such a monk has to take on his new task again. The responsible Buddhist monks now consciously believe themselves to be so far and highly developed that through meditation and vision, etc., they are able to take on their new task. They would receive information and hints where to look for the new head. The child himself is still in childhood at that time, and is brought by the monks to their center, where the child is then taught and trained for many years, so that when his time comes, he can take over his office. And the child is allegedly found by the monks because it is to be equipped with extraordinarily high consciousness vibrations, which are supposedly caught and elicited by the monks. From this, it should be evident that a child of this kind already carries out strong consciousness activities at an early age, and consequently also has a high development of consciousness, so that it is only a matter of time for the seeking monks until they come across these vibrations and find the child, which then also recognizes objects, etc., through meditative influences, etc., which, for example, are supposed to have belonged to former heads of Buddhist imprint. Of course, this explanation is very simplified.
An explanation that can be left at that, because it is true, even if it is very simple, as you say.
Contact Report 437.
Then yet again, a bulletin question which relates to the 13th Dalai Lama. The question is this. Why did the 13th Dalai Lama Mongolian Dalai Dainis Ocean of Learned Knowledge and Tibetan Blama, Ma the Superior, have to flee from the Chinese? The question is somewhat confusing, because Quetzal taught me something else, as, however, you also did. Consequently, to my knowledge, it was not the 13th Dalai Lama who fled from the Chinese, rather the 14th, who is actually called Bestandzin Gyatso, and who was born in 1935 and enthroned in 1940. His current domicile, if I am not mistaken, is Dharamsala in the constituent state of Himachal Pradesh in India. In 1959, he fled to India as the Chinese occupied Tibet, because the Dalai Lama is, in truth, not a religious head, rather a political head, even if something else is asserted by the Lamists who say that he is the highest spiritual dignitary. He emerged as the political power holder, in the context of the Tibetan government in exile led by him, in order to obtain a real autonomous Tibet through negotiations with the Chinese government, whereby the Dalai Lama is then naturally supposed to constitute the sovereign, respectively, the political ruler. The Tibetan government in exile is not officially acknowledged by any country. Even when the 14th Dalai Lama emerges as the spiritual dignitary of Lamism and officially stands up in the world for tolerance among the religions and the peoples, as well as for the observation of humanity's global responsibility, in the background, hidden in his deeds, is actually his political power nature, which he gladly wants to exercise in Tibet and, presumably, even in the entire world. With him, it is therefore about power. You have also taught me that on one hand, the Lamaist Lhasa, the Lamaist center in Tibet, is, so to speak, a secret world center in Asia, and that, secondly, Lamaism is a degenerated and despotic sect which cannot be equated with Buddhism, although the Dalai Lama and the Lamists refer to Buddhism in regard to their religion. Accordingly, the national religion of Tibet also cannot be called Buddhism, rather only Lamaism, which has nothing to do with real Buddhism, if nowadays a true Buddhism may be spoken of at all, because, even with this, very many things were distorted, and indeed even in regard to the teaching of Gautama Buddha, consequently, the real teaching was only taught, understood, and lived by the Prophet himself. The Dalai Lama, Stan Zinragya Macho, who today cruises around in the world, promotes a free Tibet, and writes books with inexpert content, is no Buddhist at all, rather a Lamist who strives for state power. Who then still wonders that he had to flee from the Chinese? The fact is that the Tibetan Lamists committed monstrous atrocities before the Chinese again took over control of Tibet, whereby, at any rate, they are also to blame for unbelievable atrocities. Naturally, this truth is vehemently disputed and denied as well as twisted from all sides. Despite these facts, most Western countries revere the Dalai Lama in particular, as also, however, do the Tibetan Lamaists, whereby neither these believers nor the Western worshippers and followers know the actual facts about the Dalai Lama and Lamaism. The believers of Lamaism are so duped that they follow the Dalai Lama blindly and neither examine the background of this nor the background of the machinations of Lamaism. There are only few real experts in the entire matter about the Dalai Lama and Lamaism, as, for example, diverse journalists who also name the facts openly, as, for example, in 2000, when the German media openly challenged the Dalai Lama and talked plainly. One, that he defames his critics, respectively, slanders them, and brings them into disrepute. 2, that he actively oppresses religious minorities, however, otherwise plays the good human. 3, that he has knowingly falsified the history of Tibet and his flight, and so forth. 4, that he perfidiously exploits his political status and his power as head of the Lamists over the believers. 5, that he oppresses any political and religious opposition to himself. 6, that he has fallen into a most extreme tyrannical and undemocratic leadership style. 7, that he maintains rituals which are misogynistic, antagonistic to women. 8, that he maintained, and maintains, friendship-based contacts with former SS members, Nazi bigwigs, as well as with neo-Nazis. What there is further to say relates to the USA, which indeed cannot possibly be any other way at all, whose Secret Service CIA plays a decisive role in the more recent history of Tibet, as Quetzal once said. The CIA, according to his statement, was the authoritative factor behind the success of the Dalai Lama's flight to India, where he lived in exile and was supported by the U.S. Secret Service as well as the guerrilla army, respectively, the armed Tibetan Lamist troops, who caused much harm and perpetrated monstrous atrocities, however, in reality, could not accomplish much to bring Tibet under their and the Dalai Lama's control. Nevertheless, however, the acts of the guerrilla army had a great significance for the morale of the community of Tibetan exiles, who fled to various countries, because they hoped that a return to a free Tibet would be possible for them, whereby they only knew the propaganda of the Dalai Lama, which is always still the case, while the truth is withheld from them. And that the CIA in Tibet also forcefully functioned in another way, was also clearly connected, among other things, with the occurrences of uranium, which the country had to offer, and which was not supposed to fall into the hands of the Russians.
Contact Report 461.
This year there will be a lot of snow around Easter time. Tibet, and Lhasa in particular, is plagued by great political and religious unrest by the population, directed against China, with the numerous monks also heavily involved, proving that they are not as peaceful as they claim to be. The reason for the bloody and destructive riots is taken as the upcoming Olympic Games, which are a welcome means of stirring up the world against China, which of course fights back harshly and ruthlessly, costing a large number of human lives. The mastermind or originator for this is the Dalai Lama, who in his stupidity works in a subterranean political and domineering way and thereby causes the unrest, whereby he, as it is usual for a wolf in sheep's clothing, handles everything in such a way that nothing can be proven against him. I attribute stupidity to the Dalai Lama because he is not able to judge what he instigates underhandedly, cannot see it through, and cannot foresee the consequences. Consequently, he irresponsibly carries out his underhanded work in such a way he is so clever again, that he only works on his followers and special helpers and messengers orally with his incitements, and does nothing in writing, so that nothing can be proven against him. Through his policy as leader of the exile government and spiritual leader, he has great influence and great power over his followers who worship him as a deity, so that he can direct his followers according to his plans and his will, without them realizing his deceitful goals, which are to become the undisputed political and spiritual ruler of Tibet and to secede it from China as independent. The Dalai Lama's supporters deliberately overlook the fact that he displays political power, as well as the fact that he drives his followers with his infamous actions into hardship and misery, and even often to their deaths, which is completely irrelevant to him and is calculatedly included in his actions. Officially, he is hypocritical and calls for moderation and peace, while he is deceitfully and underhandedly inciting his followers and believers to resistance against China and to rebellion and unrest. He does this in a way that in his stupidity he himself does not recognize as what it really is, namely that he is a religious and political rebel who by his actions and conduct drives his believing people mad and into misery and leads them into misery and into continuing enmity against China. He succeeds in this very easily because China does not enjoy a good reputation all over the world and is engaged in many inhuman and inhuman machinations. And the Dalai Lama, in his stupidity and in his striving for power, is not able to estimate what he is doing to his believers with regard to what is happening to them in need, misery and harm by China's brutal and murderous measures. Because the Chinese rulers are not squeamish and allow evil and degenerate violence to be used, as has been customary in China since time immemorial.
This is as familiar to me as his misogyny, but he knows how to hide it. So there is stink in Tibet, and as you say, especially in the capital Lhasa. I do not think much of the methods of coercion used by the government and the murderous actions of the Chinese government against enemies of the regime and those who think differently, as well as criminals, etc., because all in all it is inhuman and degrading. However, what the Dalai Lama does with the believing people falls into the same category, because through his false religious, political, and world political machinations, he lets the believers run into the open knife with the Chinese. He talks loudly about peace while he deceitfully seduces the faithful to resist China, instead of honestly trying to reach a compromise with China, by giving up his autocratic and unjustified claims of being the political ruler of Tibet and its people. He should be content to be the spiritual leader of the Tibetans who believe in him, who worship him like a god and believe that the sun will not shine if he resigns as leader of the political religious government in exile, as a Tibetan recently told me when I was talking to him in the waiting room at the doctor's office. These people are so misled by the Dalai Lama and his false speeches that they cannot understand what is really going on, and that he is the mastermind behind the fact that there has been a political fire between Tibet and China for a long time, that there is murder and manslaughter, riots, destruction, bloodshed and terror on both sides, both by the Chinese and by the Tibetans themselves, with the supposedly peaceful monks also involved. If the Dalai Lama were to do his duty as spiritual leader, he would not be involved in politics and would not have ambitions as a political leader. If he were who he claims to be, he would be striving for true love and peace and would be trying to find a peaceful solution with China by withdrawing himself as political leader and renouncing any political activity. With that, he would also save the lives of many of his believers and give them a better life, because by such an action, he would save the Tibetan people from exposing themselves to the murderous machinations of the Chinese rulers when they cause riots and uprisings. Although this would not make Tibet a state in its own right, it would lead to a compromise peace that could last until the balance of power in China changes in such a way that one day Tibet's independence can be negotiated peacefully with responsible and humane Chinese leaders, and that this independence can actually be achieved. However, as long as the Tibetan people are still controlled by a Dalai Lama who is greedy for political power and is not prepared to make the necessary compromise, much disaster will continue to befall the misguided Tibetans.
Contact Report 462.
And while we're on the subject of unpleasantness, I would like to ask you if you know a little bit more today about the Tibet-China thing, by which I mean the Olympic torch relay, which is supposed to go through several countries of the world, and even to Mount Everest. I could imagine that the Tibetans in exile and their followers, and those of the Dalai Lama will demonstrate against it worldwide.
This corresponds to the reality, because through the Dalai Lama's false propaganda and his political and religious machinations, a great many people are being incited and misled with regard to his real intentions and the reality of what is happening in Tibet and its context. Thus, many innocent people are being misled about the reality of things against China and the Olympics, causing riots, Olympic boycott cries, fisticuffs, be incited to other violence and demonstrations, and tarnish the apolitical spirit of the Olympics.
The Dalai Lama's machinations regarding his claim to power over Tibet and its aspired independence from China is a purely political matter and has nothing to do with the Olympics in China. The fact that he is nevertheless deceitfully inciting his believers and other followers against China and the Olympics in a political way is something that they obviously do not realize, nor do all those government-incompetent rulers who hype him up and see him as a saint. These rulers are so dumb and stupid that they think they can bask in his spirituality and shine with it, not realizing that they are shaking hands with a wolf in sheep's clothing, as you called him. As a clergyman, he is hypocrisy itself, and what he has to do politically with China is his business alone, for it is he alone among all Tibetans who claims spiritual and political might for Tibet. So, from his side, the whole thing is only a primitive claim to power, through which he is at loggerheads with China, which in turn exerts evil violence in Tibet, with the Tibetans, and indeed also the supposedly peaceful monks, exerting counter-violence. This violence is also exercised by the Dalai Lama, even if he does it deceitfully through the believers and other followers he has misled, who leave their blood or are otherwise harassed or punished, while not a hair on his head is touched. But this should not distract from the fact that China, just like the Dalai Lama and the Tibetans, also commits evil mistakes and spreads fear, terror, horror and death through evil violence, only that China does it openly and thus infuriates the world, while the Dalai Lama remains unscathed through his nasty, deceitful machinations, because officially nothing can be proven against him, since he only preaches peace in public, but sows misguidance and violence in the background.
His believers and other followers do not want to see or know the real truth.
Contact Report 463.
The Olympic torch relay is very much disturbed in practically all countries by demonstrations and violent attacks by Tibetans and Tibetans living in the countries where the torch relay takes place. There is howling and raving against China and demands for free Tibet. Of course, the Dalai Lama is behind all this with his anti-China propaganda. He knows how to get his followers in a rage just by threatening to resign as the big boss of the exile government, because they see in him the real savior.
This is what is real. The Dalai Lama uses his believers and other followers to turn the Olympics into an act of political terror and to insult and denigrate China in every possible way. Of course, China has been a state of violence and injustice since ancient times, but what is done by the Dalai Lama and his followers and believers is not right. And that here now, the peaceful, competitive spirit of the Olympics is turned into a political power struggle by the machinations of the Dalai Lama and his believers and followers. This is not only wrong and very regrettable, but criminal, inhumane, criminal, and a farce of the very same kind. Consequently, every human being who joins in the Dalai Lama's power-hungry machinations disrupts the Olympic torch relay, cries out obscene words against China, and demands a free Tibet is in the wrong. This is not the way and not an act of peace, but an evil act of open terror, of which every human being is guilty who participates in such actions or also cultivates thoughts in this way. For Tibet cannot be freed by the Dalai Lama's conjured-up worldwide terror against China, for China is rightly not getting involved in this. Should it be that Tibet will one day become independent, then this will require lengthy negotiations as well as reason and logic, which, however, cannot be conducted by the power-hungry Dalai Lama and his envoys, but only by neutral negotiating partners who themselves do not seek religious and political power, as is the case with the Dalai Lama and his envoys.
It is a boundless disgrace for all those who harass China with regard to the Olympics and the Olympic torch relay, because it is not the Chinese regime that is fundamentally affected by the demonstrations and violent machinations of the fools who are believers and followers of the Dalai Lama, but the entire Chinese population. It is already no longer just stupid. It is even primitive and indeed, as you say, criminal to call what the demonstrators and perpetrators of violence against the Olympic torch relay and against the Chinese people, under the insidious leadership and wicked machinations of the Dalai Lama and his vicious underground army, are doing and are jeopardizing the Chinese people's right to hold and experience an Olympic Games in their country at long last.
Contact Report 465.
Just as the Dalai Lama is being hailed and given unjustified aid by all the world's innocent people, while China and its people are being rammed to the ground. Of course, it is no coincidence that there is such an evil sentiment against China. If one thinks of all the horrors that have been repeatedly brought to light in China since time immemorial, but the fact that the Dalai Lama's criminal political machinations are being praised unscrupulously and against all existing truth of his evil deeds is unjust.
Earth humans neither want to see the truth nor know or accept it because they prefer to be deceived and deceived by false words of hypocrites.
Contact Report 487.
And I have a bulletin question to answer directly in regard to the Dalai Lama, because people simply do not want to understand what is really going on with this bloke and that he is not the peaceful human being which he always pretends, worldwide, to be. Truly, he is certainly not a holiness, that is to say, a venerable one. Rather, he is a feigned holiness. The reader's question which I shall answer is, why do you abusively insult the Dalai Lama, who is really a peace-loving and good human being? That which you write about him in your bulletins is unbelievable. A. Sanders, Germany.
Lies, bigotry, and slander hold very much more weight for the Earth humans than does the truth.
An article has also appeared in which something is said about that which is really behind the Dalai Lama. So, the talk therein is also that the truth about him is this. He pretends to be a worldwide apostle of peace, and is followed by millions of faithful who transfer millions in funds to him, with which he can carry out and finance his secret work in Tibet. Millions from which the misogynist can also live very well, whereby it is primarily the woman, of all people, who believe in him, who finance him as thanks, as it were, that he is ill-disposed towards them. But, because of his faked pious and peace-loving nature, they do not realize it. But his image as an apostle of peace does not correspond to the truth, just as his holiness is also only the mask of his sanctimoniousness. Born Tenzin Gyatso, he was appointed, as a child, to the position of 14th Dalai Lama, respectively, to the position of the highest ecclesiastical dignitary and political head of Lamaism. Enthroned from 1935 until 1940, he fled to India after China occupied Tibet in 1959 and ended the bloody goings-on and the serfdom maintained by the Dalai Lama, and the punishments of blinding, flogging, hacking off of limbs and appropriation of the property of Tibetans who had committed punishable offenses. He set up his Indian residence in Dharamsala in the state of Himachal Pradesh. Since the advent of the Tibetan government in exile, he has been the leader whereby, however, this government in exile is not officially acknowledged by any country. Nevertheless, however, many powerful state figures of diverse countries crawl up the Dalai Lama's backside and help him. Officially, the government in exile supports negotiations with the Chinese government in order to obtain real autonomy for Tibet. At the international level, the Dalai Lama sanctimoniously devotes himself to love, peace, freedom and tolerance among the religions and peoples, as well as to the observation of humanity's global responsibility. For that reason, he was also awarded the Nobel Peace Prize and thereby, however, the fact was completely disregarded, probably due to ignorance, that, behind his actions and his sanctimonious behavior, he strives for religious and political might, and leads a Tibetan resistance movement. This positions itself against the brutal force of the Chinese, and has caused great harm since it has been in existence. The members of this underground army call themselves freedom fighters, whereby, however, in reality, they commit terrorist acts against the Chinese occupiers. The weapons they employ are extremely varied and range from slingshots, knives, pistols and rifles, and swords, right up to captured Chinese artillery. Therewith, and by means of their underhandedness, their hate and their thirst for blood and revenge, which they call fearlessness, they taught the Chinese occupiers angst, but they also taught them to raise themselves up, more brutally than ever, against the Tibetans. And all that leads back to the so peaceful and love-preaching Dalai Lama. Truly, there is nothing pertaining to the freedom fighters, secretly led by the Dalai Lama, which would position them passively against the Chinese occupation, because peace readiness is, for them, just as much a sanctimonious farce and, indeed, exactly to the degree maintained by their leader. Yet the simple Tibetans, as well as the exiled Tibetans, and the worldwide believers and followers of the Dalai Lama, know nothing of all that. However, the Chinese Tibetan occupation, for which the whole thing is a military nightmare, knows better. And one can understand this well when one knows that the Tibetan underground army, Chushi Gangdruk, still exists today and carries out its murderous mischief against the Chinese occupation. This underground army, led by Gyalo Thondup, a brother of the Dalai Lama, was, namely, never disbanded. Earlier, they were supported by the US-American CIA, and indeed for around 25 years. When this was the case, the Dalai Lama also managed to obtain the USA's support for himself and the exiled Tibetan court against China. Thereby, with this Dalai Lama-USA connection, armed conflicts were also fought out with the Chinese occupiers by means of USA powers and Tibetan Chushi Gangdruk fighters, whereby it was said of the Tibetan peace fighters that over a long period of time, for every Tibetan killed, 10 Chinese had been killed. The Dalai Lama's flight was already prepared in 1951, and indeed with the help of the US-American Secret Service's CIA, whereby, at the same time, with their help, great treasures were also already secretly smuggled to India out of the Dalai Lama's main city, Lhasa, primarily gold dust and silver bullion with a current value of around 65 million Swiss francs, respectively, about 47.5 million euros. Then, years later, the Dalai Lama's flight took place, well organized by the CIA, which had earlier, in the USA, already trained a small elite army of freedom fighters, and indeed in Camp Hale in the Rocky Mountains, which then also accompanied and protected the Dalai Lama as he fled. It comprised around 350 soldiers and 50 freedom fighters. But that was not enough, because the elite fighters had still other tasks to carry out, as, for example, the guerrilla war, but also in that they, as paratroopers, jumped out of smuggled B-17 bombers which bore no national emblems and led a terrorist form of war against the brutal Chinese occupiers. And so that they could not talk, they were equipped with very fast-acting cyanide poison capsules, which they were required to swallow in the event of being taken prisoner. Yet that was still not enough, because the CIA also pottered about outside of Tibet, as, for example, in the Kingdom of Mustang in Nepal, where a rebel army of more than 12,000 terrorist fighters was set up, which carried out murderous actions against the Chinese occupation in Nepal. And the fact that all the CIA machinations, in association with Tibet, has cost the USA hundreds of millions of dollars, is naturally clear. Yet even today, that is not known by the American people. Also, that the Dalai Lama was paid $186,000 annually would not be known by the American people. Only in 1972 was the CIA's direct support for the Tibetan resistance suspended, only, however, to be continued by a private, although federally organized, financing, as well as by means of the help of ignorant Dalai Lama followers. One can name, for example, the NED National Endowment for Democracy, which spent, and still spends, millions of US dollars in order to damage China and to claim that China steers the bloody unrest in Tibet. The NED claims this contrary to better knowledge, and self-evidently contrary to its denial of all its activities in regard to that. And what the CIA carried out earlier in Tibet is carried out these days in secret by His Feigned Holiness, the Dalai Lama.
Contact Report 618.
And to this article here in relation to the explanations and the descriptions from the book The Shadow of the Dalai Lama, it is to be said that effective facts are mentioned, which, however, on the one hand, are not accepted as truth by the believers who follow the Dalai Lama, and, on the other hand, by various governments of various countries as well as by many of the world's population, whereby blinded faith reasons play just as large a role as also profit reasons in relation to secret service, political and economic machinations, etc.
I will also add the other article that appeared in the journal Taxi under the title Der Schleiermacher by Martin Ulrich, which is sold by unemployed people who can earn a supplement to their welfare money. The article is freely available and published by the editors of Taxi for Figu, and is a treatment of the book The Shadow of the Dalai Lama, 816 pages, by Victor and Victoria Tremondi, published by Patmos in 1999. The content of the article and the book is about the Dalai Lamas, etc., and their inhumane, misanthropic, and inhuman machinations in Tibet. Unfortunately, there are no more books about this article in bookshops, because they are sold out. Some people say that the majority of the 1999 edition was bought up and destroyed by Dalai Lama friends. Whether this really corresponds to the facts is unfortunately not known. The book is unfortunately out of print, but may still be found as red copies in second-hand bookshops and at Amazon. Similarly to this book, The Shadow of the Dalai Lama, there is another work worth reading by an author called Colin Goldner, entitled The Case of a God King, 2nd edition 2008 expanded, 736 pages, ISBN 73352-2-86569-021-2-1 from Albini Verlag, Aschaffenburg. Although this book, which is also worth reading, is still available in bookshops, so it can still be bought by those interested.
Contact Report 723.
1949. As for the present Dalai Lama, who is already in the service and on the payroll of the USA and the CIA with many dollars, he is now doing everything he can to shake up Chinese oppression through a guerrilla movement, financially supported by the USA with millions of dollars, which he will make act violently against the Chinese. In the process, as already mentioned, he is chosen as the 14th Dalai Lama, whose real name is Tenzin Gyatso, to be the ringleader of the Tibetan free fighters with large bribes from the USA, who in his greed for money has already allowed himself to be bought by the Secret Service. The Dalai Lama is a liar who is already deceiving the whole world in his juveniles, and will also lie and deceive the world throughout his life, as very clear foresight clearly proves. He will do everything in this respect and try to present himself as a peaceful angel, but in reality he is a wolf in sheep's clothing, and will be partly responsible for all the violent riots in Tibet that will continue well into the third millennium. He will stop at nothing, just as the entire criminal Nazi regime in Nazi Germany stopped at nothing. So everything will be completely different from the Dalai Lama and Tibet-friendly propaganda worldwide, and all lies and deceit will be carried far into the future. But also in Tibet many things will change when the Dalai Lama, who is still young and selfish today, will flee to India and then to the West in 10 years' time and consequently leave his believers in Tibet in the lurch and far behind him, and he will live a good and lying life paid for by stupid believers in foreign countries until old age. And in all respects, even after his flight in 10 years' time, he will live carelessly on large donations and tributes from his stupid believers and other godly followers, as has been the case with all religious leaders since time immemorial, and will also remain so for a long time to come.
Contact Report 754.
If only the Buddhist sectarianism of Lamaism in Tibet is examined, it reveals the same evil as in Myanmar. For what the Lamas and Panchen Lamas have done there would knock Siddhartha Gautama's hat off his head, and he would turn over in his grave in disgust, shame and pain. Note Wikipedia. Panchen Lama is the title of an important reincarnation lineage of the Gelag order in Tibetan Buddhism. The Panchen Lama is considered the second highest Trulku of the Gelugpa, and traditionally the emanation of the Buddha of immeasurable light, Amitabha. If I were to describe the atrocities of Lamaism in Tibet alone, I would have to write several books about it, but I can recommend a book that shows some of what has become of Buddhist sects that practice completely false teachings of Buddhism that have absolutely no real connection to the original teachings of Siddhartha Gautama anymore. To gain a really clear insight into yesterday's and today's Buddhist sects, especially Lamaism and its Panchen Lama, as well as the equally mendacious Dalai Lama Tenzin Gyatso, note, today's Dalai Lama, who is especially adored by women, although he despises and hates them abysmally. I wonder why. The book, The Shadow of the Dalai Lama, by Victor and Victoria Tremondi, Patmos Verlag, Dusseldorf, is recommended.
Contact Report 775.
1947. America, since time immemorial, especially now through Harry S. Truman, who since his installation as the 33rd President of the USA, secretly and without the knowledge of the people, interferes in the political affairs between China and Tibet because of wanting to drive the Chinese out of Tibet. This is the case because he secretly worships the current Dalai Lama, who, as a 5-year-old boy in 1940, was enthroned as the 14th Dalai Lama, who is listed as the head of the Tibetans. He is supposed to be a man of peace in the future, but in reality, he is not. In truth, even at his young age, he is a high-handed and devious rebel, conspirator, insurrectionist, and evil terror to the women whose enemy he is, which he knows how to conceal. Consequently, they will follow him. However, he doesn't like them while he lyingly pretends equal rights to them, in order to secure their allegiance to him and needed support, as well as to be sure of their gifts of grace to the religious leader. Contrary to his hypocrisy, it must be said that even at his young age he is only a man of discord, falsehood, and misogyny, and as religiously mendacious as others and the Panchen Lamas before him. Their believers who were in bondage to them were, and still are, mistreated worse than slaves. By means of torture, their torturers cut off fingers, hands, arms, legs, or ears of the believers, or they allowed their believers to be blinded if they did not do what was demanded of them. With my own ears, I heard the 14th Dalai Lama idealizing the conditions in the former Tibet, where I saw with my own eyes the opposite of what he mendaciously claimed. With my own eyes, I saw how the Lamaist monks, together with some members of a noble class, chastised serfs and slaves who were supervised by the monk police and were subjected to corporal punishment with gay vault that mutilated their limbs or even blinded them. A fact, however, that will be disputed by the Tibetan government in exile when the 14th Dalai Lama, aka Tenzin Gyatso, waves his scepter and flees Tibet. However, as far as the present Dalai Lama is concerned, who is on the payroll of the USA and the CIA with many dollars, he tries to do everything possible to shake the Chinese occupation, namely with a guerrilla movement financially supported by the USA with many millions of dollars, which the young Dalai Lama allows to proceed against the Chinese with gavolt. As the 14th Dalai Lama and with slush funds from the USA, as already said, he thereby becomes the ringleader of the Tibetan freedom fighters, who, in his greed for might and money, allows himself to be bought by the Secret Service CIA. Already since his youth, the young 14th Dalai Lama has been a liar, wherethrough he deceives the whole world and will prove this doing all his life, which clearly conducted foresights show clearly. He will present himself as a peaceful angel, but who in reality is a wolf in sheep's clothing, who will be partly responsible for all the gewaltsome riots in Tibet until the 3rd decade of the 3rd millennium. He will not shy away from any infamous action, which he will conceal from the outside world after he has fled Tibet and will continue his life in the government in exile under the protection of the USA. Therefore, everything will be totally different from his Tibet-friendly propaganda worldwide, and all the lies and deceit will be carried far into the future. But everything will change in Tibet when the young and selfish 14th Dalai Lama will flee and consequently abandon his believers in Tibet, when he will live a good but mendacious life in government in exile until old age, paid for by believers of low intelligentum. And even after his escape, he will live in a carefree form from large taxes, gifts and donations from his believers that are of low intelligentum and from devoted followers, as has been the case with all religious leaders since time immemorial, and will remain so in the distant future.